Everybody, we'll wait for everyone to roll in. Welcome to Sportsbox webinar with Dr. Phil Cheetham and Dana Dahlquist. We're really excited for this. The backstory here is that this was meant to be done live at the Open Forum at the PGA show this year, but this is even better because we get to control the setting and we're all comfortable at home, and yeah, and the quality of the content will be the same. So we're really excited for this. My name is Ji-Hei Lee. I'm the CEO, founder of Sportsbox AI. I am also joined by our team members, Ryan Crawley, our Director of Education, and then Paul Park, our VP of Business Operations. And we are super, super excited for this. It's a topic that all of us in golf are very interested in. Anyone who studies data, who is interested in data, there are different sets of data out there, obviously the ball flight and club delivery data, but also as it relates to the swing, there's the motion data, kinematics and kinetics. I've seen a version of this presentation from these two gentlemen, and it was super, super educational on how these things all relate to one another to make better sense of what's going on when you look at certain sets of data. So hopefully it's something that will be meaningful to everybody in the room. And we also welcome questions from the participants. Feel free to use the Q&A chat to drop any questions along the way. I'll try to moderate. I don't have a long housekeeping session, but I do want to make a short announcement about a new product. You guys are probably familiar with this, but in case you are not, we've obviously been a mobile first company. All our 3D mocap products are built into your mobile phones so that you can just shoot and get 3D motion data in an avatar. But we also introduced a new product that works on a Windows PC and pairs with 1 camera, 2 camera, or 3 cameras to run in an indoor bay setting, seamlessly integrated with the bay experience. So let me just show you guys one quick video to kick us off, and then I'll hand things off to Phil. The audio might not play, but basically what you're seeing is that there's a camera here and then a down the line camera that's capturing the swing. And it instantly loads a slow-mo replay of that video so you can visualize it in 2D. And as soon as the 3D data is ready, they kind of pop up along the bottom like you see here. And those tiles are totally customizable. You can put anything that you want to work on in your swing and keep swinging, or go into this kind of analysis mode with the avatar for a deeper dive. And as you saw, you can move the avatar around in free form, kind of every direction, not just the 6 preset, face on, down the line, back, and above and below, but also just kind of free form in every direction. Yeah, and all of the features that you've seen in our app, you'll be able to do, except you also have the ability to pair the down the line video with the face on video, draw lines, see how they compare to the 3D data. And you can also do pro reference range comparison here. You can also look at graphs for each of the trackers. And then compare 2 swings in this flow as well. All right, so with that, I will wrap this up and hand it off to Phil to get the presentation started.
Thanks, Ji-Hei. I will share my screen and then bring up the presentation. All right. So let's get started. The presentation today is about motion and forces and how they are related to one another in the golf swing. Of course, forces create motion, and motion is reflected or reflective of the forces themselves. So I'll give you, as usual, background, and then Dana will take over with the coaching tips and the coaching examples of how to use Sportsbox to see the things that we're going to talk about. Anyway, as I said, let's start off with a little bit of background, a little bit of theory. Motion and forces. Well, motion in terms of biomechanics is called kinematics. And kinematics is the motion of objects or bodies without concern to the forces or the torques that produce that motion. So I like to think of it as the look, because it's what you can really see. It's the motion itself. Whereas forces are called kinetics, and kinematics and kinetics are the two main fields of biomechanics, by the way. And kinematics are really the forces and the interactions that produce or affect motion. Now, kinetics does include internal muscle forces, and it also includes the external forces like gravity and ground reaction forces. I'll talk mainly about ground reaction forces today, but you must remember that the way that you create motion is by contracting your muscles, and they pull upon your bones, and then those bones move your limbs, or they are part of your limbs, of course. But in order to create a golf swing, you're in contact with the ground. And so gravity helps us with the golf swing. Without gravity, it'd be very hard to produce a golf swing. Yeah, so anyway, that's kinetics and kinematics. Now, there's another area that I'd like to talk about, or another term, if you like, and it's called 6 degrees of freedom of motion. And this is one of the things that is a powerful aspect of Sportsbox. We measure the pelvis and the chest and other parts of the body as well in what we call 6 degrees of freedom. So those 6 degrees of freedom are broken up into 3 degree of freedom branches, if you like. Position, which is linear motion, and those are sway, thrust, and lift. Sway being side to side motion, thrust being forward back towards the ball, and lift being up and down. And so those, like I said, are the linear motions. But we also have 3 rotational motions that our body can move in. And those are called bend, side bend, and turn. So bend is motion around a side-to-side axis, which means you're bending forward and backward. Side bend is, as the name says, you're bending sideways. So that's around an axis that goes from front to back through your body. And then turn, of course, is a vertical, around a vertical axis, and it's the turning left to right, or in golf turns, open and closed. So these are the 6 ways that your body can move. And it's very important to remember that I'm just going to get the laser pointer here. Let me turn that on. For some reason, it doesn't seem to be coming up. Anyway, it looks like you should be able to see my arrow. The pelvis and the chest are 2 separate body segments that can move independently. And so each one, the pelvis and the chest, can go through all of these 6 degrees of motion. Now, let's relate motion to forces and forces to motion. There are kind of 5 forces. And by the way, forces in this discussion will include torque. And torque is really the rotational equivalent of a force. It's a turning force, if you like. Think of it that way. And so we do have, just like we do in motion, we have a kinematic sequence. In forces, we have a kinetic sequence. And here are 5 of the main forces and torques in the kinetic sequence and how they relate to motion. So we've got horizontal force to start with, and those produce sway and slide motions. we have frontal plane torque, and that produces the side-to-side motion, side bend, and what we call sway gap. Horizontal plane torque, that's rotation around a horizontal plane. And those are, as I said here, torques, and those are related directly to the body turns and X factors. Then we also have sagittal plane torque, which is thrust and forward tilt. And then we have vertical force, which is drop and lift. So let's now look at those and how they relate to one another. Unfortunately, I won't have enough time to talk about all of these, but I'm going to focus on horizontal plane torque and vertical force. And the reason I'm going to talk about those specifically is because they're very topical in our new speed profile that we've created. We introduced this at the PGA show, and it was a big hit. A lot of instructors were very interested in how they could get a hold of this. And so in a nutshell, what we've done is we've taken 4 groups of parameters, or we call them trackers, 4 groups of trackers, and we've put them into a single one-pager report. We've got rotational speed, we've got rotational range of motion, we've got verticals, and we've got release characteristics. And I'll talk a little bit about rotational speed, verticals, and rotational range of motion. In this talk, I won't hit on release. We'll probably do that in another seminar. Anyway, in rotational speed, we're looking at the kinematic sequence max speeds of the pelvis rotation, the chest rotation, arm swing speed, and shaft swing speed. And for the rotational range of motion, we're looking at chest turn in the backswing, pelvis turn max, and X factor max. For the verticals, we look at pelvis drop and lift. And these have been correlated, of course, to club head speed because it is a speed profile. And then finally, release, which is lead arm at arm 30 degrees, wrist release percent, and hand speed max. Now, the other cool thing about this report is we've created an algorithm that allows us, firstly, to measure your, well, Sportsbox measures your speed, but the algorithm that we've created allows us to give you a potential speed if we manipulate some of these parameters. So say you're low on pelvis speed. If we up that pelvis speed by 10% or bring you to the normal average speed of a tour pro, which is pretty good, then we can see what your potential speed would be. And it actually also gives you a score. It ranks you, comparing you to our tour pro database. It ranks you from 0 to 100 as a percentile. And so that's how we get the length of each one of these bars, which allows us to see where you're on track and where you're leaking speed. So where are your strengths and where are your weaknesses? This allows us to see that. Okay, so let's talk about, firstly, the torque, which would be the rotational ranges of motion and the rotational speeds. So torque is rotational force in a horizontal plane, and it's what causes you to turn. So in terms of Sportsbox readings and things that we can calculate, we can look at turn and X factor. So here we have pelvis turn, and pelvis turn, as I've mentioned, is rotation around a local vertical axis in your pelvis. It's important to remember that we have 3D, and because we're using 3D, we're able to be very accurate, and we're able to measure the turn around that vertical axis that moves with your pelvis. So if your pelvis, and this is applicable to the chest as well, so if either of them, one bends forward or bends sideways, then that axis moves, and we still get a very accurate measurement of your turn. So in other words, you can think of it as if you're looking straight down from on top of the chest, looking down the chest, and straight down from on top of the pelvis. And that gives you the turn angle very accurately. But anyway, what's important here, I'm not going to go through every single number because I wanted to focus on the maximum, which occurs during the backswing. So you can see in this graph, we've got open up the top and closed down the bottom. And you can see that as you go into your backswing, the rotation gets larger in the closed direction. And importantly, you start to transition before the top of backswing and move into your into the downswing and start turning towards the downswing before the top of backswing. Top of backswing, by the way, is defined by when the club turns around. That's an important definition. Anyway, let's go back to the numbers. Men, 48 degrees at this maximum point. That is right about here. And women about 51 degrees, which is also right about there. So at the top of backswing, you'll see that we've actually decreased slightly. Men have decreased down to 45 and women have decreased down to 48. And that's because they've already started turning into the downswing. And this is the way that you generate power. You generate that rotational torque by turning rapidly into the downswing. So and how fast you're moving is given by the slope of this curve. So we can actually calculate your speed, your velocity of rotation as well, which I'll talk about in just a minute. So of note, though, is at impact, you're open by almost the same, with the pelvis anyway, almost the same in your backswing is what you are at the point of impact. So if you're looking at range of motion, and of course, range of motion is important because we want to know how much space or how much room you've got to generate speed. And so this range of motion is important. So if you look at backswing max of 48, downswing of 41, you've got like 89 degrees, nearly 90 degrees, at least for the men, of rotation space, if you like, in which you can generate that speed. So that's key. So those are the things that we can look at in that speed profile. Okay, let's move on to the chest. Chest is very similar in terms of the shape of the curve and what happens during the swing. It's just that the numbers are larger because your chest rotates more, because now not only do you have the legs that are allowing you to rotate, but you've got your midsection as well. Your abs and your core allows you to rotate even more. So here again, the chest will rotate into the downswing before the top of backswing, allowing the arm to compress on your chest and to get extra strength and extra power in the downswing. Okay, so we have a max of 94 degrees, but at the top of backswing, it's down to 92 degrees. That's because it started turning in the downswing. And by impact, we're at 29 degrees open. So notice that the chest is still open, but not as open as the pelvis. And we'll see that in the X factor when I come to talk about the X factor. So again, you've got a large range of motion from 94 degrees closed to 29 degrees open in which to generate the torque, and in which allows you to use that torque to generate the speed, should I say. That's a better way to word it. And so if these ranges of motion are low, then you've got less time and less space to generate those speeds. So that's why a large range of motion is in the speed report, and that's important to look at. Okay, move on to the X factor. Now, the X factor is basically a combination of pelvis and chest turn. It's their differential, but it's not just simply, as you can kind of see in this diagram, it looks like it's just the difference between one chest turn and two pelvis turn. But it's a little more complicated than that, because in 3D, as I said earlier, you can side bend and you can forward bend. And so they make it a little more complicated. There has to be a 3D algorithm to work it out. And so you can't just subtract pelvis rotation from chest rotation to get X factor. It'll be close, but it'll be a few degrees off. Anyway, that's kind of a technical side of it that we don't really have to delve into. But at pelvis transition, now it's slightly different here because it maxes out, because it's the differential between the two, it maxes out in the downswing rather than in the backswing. And the reason for that is because the pelvis begins to turn first and the chest is still turning while the pelvis is turning into the downswing. So the X factor is stretching, and that's known as the X factor stretch. And that puts more tension on your abdomen and your obliques and your muscles in your core. And so if we look at the numbers here, I'll just focus on a couple. At the pelvis transition, that's when the pelvis turns around and begins to rotate into the downswing. The X factor is 48 for men and 52 for women. Now at the top, now it's kind of opposite to what I just showed you. It's getting larger because it's rotating into the downswing and the pelvis is rotating and the chest is rotating in the other direction. So if we look at that, the downswing maximum becomes 53 for the men and 59 for the women. So the X factor stretch is 48 to 53, which is about 5 degrees for the men, and it looks to be 52 to 59, so 7 degrees for the women. And as I said, that extra stretch increases the muscle tension in your abs and allows you to fire stronger. So these are all very interesting measurements that we can do with Sportsbox that give the coach insight into how they're generating force and how they're generating speed. Okay, speaking of speed, let's look at the kinematic sequence. Now, in the kinematic sequence, what that is you start your rotation from the ground and it transmits up because you're generating forces from the ground. And so the first thing to accelerate is going to be, as I said, your pelvis. It accelerates and then slightly decelerates. And that allows it to transfer energy to the chest, which also accelerates and then decelerates, transmitting energy to the arm, which does the same. It accelerates, reaches a maximum, decelerates, and then basically whips the shaft, and the club head hits the ball at impact at its maximum speed. So what we can do is we can measure these maximum speeds, and we can give you an idea of how you're doing with respect to the Tour Pro numbers. And then we can give you what we call a percentile ranking. And that'll show us where you may be leaking speed or where you may be gaining speed. One of these may be way larger than the other. Typically with the Tour Pros, they're turning at about a maximum of 480 degrees per second, which is a little over 1 revolution per second. 1 revolution would be 360 degrees per second. And so chest is about 730, arm 1,000, and then the shaft of the club is 2,280. And remember, these are rotational measurements, so they are in fact in degrees per second. But the speed report lets us look at these and lets us see where we've got any leaks or speed gains. And why is that important? Well, because your body speeds generate the club head speed. And we found from our research that the turn speeds are in fact directly correlated with club head speed. I'm not going to go through the numbers here, but you can see that there is a correlation, and it gets larger as we get closer to the ball. So the shaft speed is the largest correlation, which if you think about it, logically makes sense. So the reason I've got this up here is just to show you from our Tour database, we found that each one of these, pelvis turn speed, chest turn speed, arm swing speed, and shaft swing speed, all are important and correlate directly with club head speed. Okay.
A time check, though, we're at 4:26.
Yeah, one more. I think I've got 2 more slides and I'll be done. So the next one is vertical force causes lift. And so we're going to look at lift and drop. So here, this is really interesting because we've found that generating vertical lift really helps club speed, helps increase club speed. So you can see 2 profiles here. One is what we call a jumper. So this is a large drop and in the downswing, reaching a maximum drop and then lifting rapidly into impact. And in fact, you can see from the numbers here that the long drive champions have a huge lift, about 5 inches, whereas the tour pros, they have a good lift as well, but it's only about 1.7, like let's say 2 inches. The women are about the same, about 2 inches. And so just in a nutshell, and just to summarize, pelvis drop and lift are important parameters in the speed profile because they also are correlated with club head speed. So I will pass this now on to Dana, and he'll give you some examples of how he uses these Sportsbox parameters, these Sportsbox trackers and indicators to work with and to train with, and how they can help generate speed.
Perfect. All right. Thank you, Phil. Let me do this. So share a screen. And make sure this is going. Okay. All right. So everybody see that okay? Is that a yes?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, perfect. All right. And pull that back up. Okay, so I have basically 2 things to show. Okay, so here's Bryson. I'm going to move this title up. Okay, so one of the big conversations that I get with players when they come in, they use Sportsbox is, I would say, number one, I'm not going to talk about tour pros for a minute, but I'm going to talk about quality of impact. So it's suffice to say that a regular player, when we look at a beginner, has a quality of impact issue. And so generally speaking, we're going to limit motion in order to get the mechanics to be better. And one of the advantages with Sportsbox is seeing like side-to-side motion and up and down. So when we have pelvis sway, which is the 3rd tile over, and chest sway, which is a 4th, we look at those players and we go, okay, like if we can limit that, we can control contact. And as we move along the spectrum, and we get into better and better players, we have to look at how much force can we put in the system. Now, the reason why I'm using Bryson is because he is kind of like a centered pivot player relative to another example I'm going to show you in a little bit. And they're still trying to do the same thing. They're both trying to hit the ball far. And they're both trying to have quality of impact. And so we have to kind of ask ourselves, like, number one, which piece are we looking for first? Now, with tour players, they're already going to hit the ball solid. So when we look at Bryson just off the ball, when he goes from address to, let's say, position 2, right there, okay, we can see at position 2, he's only shifted, from that address position, like just less than an inch. But we also know that on force data, that he's pushing excessively hard into his right leg in order to create more torque. Okay, and this is about the time around P2 on the force plates where you start seeing a very large braking force. Okay, so the system that I currently use would show that he's putting a lot of torque in his system, particularly an equal distribution of what we call frontal plane torque, which is basically like a vertical force, and horizontal plane torque, which is what Phil was describing. So that shows up when we look at him as pelvis turn and chest turn. Conversely, when we look at him as well, going to the top, you can see he's still pushing, or stabilizing, if you want to call it that. But it's pretty clear with his left foot off the ground that, a centered pivot player is producing a lot of force through that trail side in order to create a centered pivot. So this is one of those caveats where I think the teachers kind of go, well, I want to have my player be consistent, okay, which is the number one thing I think we all look for as teachers. What are some things that emulate that? So if we have a player that's moving too much side to side or not getting enough lift per se, it's like, how do we kind of create constraints around that? without losing that, athleticism at the same point. And that's where the developmental side of this kind of comes into the conversation. I think everybody wants to hit the ball further, but at the same token, like, we don't want to move massively side to side. So one of the things that's interesting is from that position up to P4 through kind of about P5, you'll see that because of the amount of force he's put through his system, that force has also pushed him forward. And what's interesting, if we look at it from a traditional golf mindset here, if I just put a line here and then I go, okay, like in 2D, pretty lined up, but also I can see that the pelvis is 3 degrees forward and the chest is 3 degrees forward, or inches forward. So I know that that's a pretty stable axis all the way to this point. And so I know for most of my players, if they're doing this and there isn't instability going on and they're able to add force to their system, they're not losing consistency along the way. Because typically speaking, when you do add more force to most players, they start to lose those consistency factors. Okay. So that's kind of an interesting one. I think it's a good description of what we're going to see with even a lot of beginner players. They need to understand, like, we want to be centered, but we need to understand that there is in order to produce that type of rotation, there needs to be a force in order to do it. You just can't move standing still. I'm going to show one more example here. There we go.
Dana, if you push that thumbnail all the way to the side, it should minimize me too.
Oh, really? Okay. There we go. Perfect. All right. So here's another high ball speed player, college player. Okay. All right. So take him to P1. Okay. So here with Alex, he's another high-speed ball player, 185 ball speed, 187, somewhere in there. Also very accurate. And we're going to look at a little bit of a different scenario. Okay. So with Alex, he shifts quite a bit right. And so when I look at, and I'll show this example momentarily, that there are a lot of different ways to skin this cat. And so in Alex's case, he loads, if you want to call it loading, he shifts his mass a little right of center and then pushes back towards the center again. Okay, so basically arriving to the same position that Bryson was at. But the pattern's different because he actually hits more of a straight ball to a slight fade off the tee. So in doing such, he's not as forward through the transition. So he's slightly less forward in order to do that. And so very similar to like a Victor Hovland, where Victor loads a little bit more right, if you want to call it loading. It's not really loading, but he pushes his system more to the right before he breaks that force to create torque, and it keeps his alignments in a slightly different position. Whereas if you looked at Rory McIlroy, he's a little bit more forward at this position. So I think when you start looking at it in these, like, I call it kind of in different narratives. What's the selected ball flight? What does the player desire to do? You're going to start seeing these patterns kind of coincide. And quite frankly, you start building your own toolbox around them relative to the desired shot shape. So if Alex was more shifted forward, he'd have more of a difficult time hitting it in his particular fashion on the arc. Now, what are some similarities? Well, you start seeing similarities potentially in the X factor stretch, in the separation. When Phil was talking about speed, those things tend to line up, but the geometry might just be different, on the horizontal side of things. So I think for, people at home, like I said, number one, because I teach amateurs most of the time. So we're always looking for quality of strike more than anything. And that kind of comes up to my next conversation here. So Let me bring up this. Actually, I'll just drop it. Sorry for this. It's easier to do it this way. I had it up and then it closed. Boom. And here we go. And there we go. Okay, so let's go right here. Okay. So this is kind of what we're talking about. The big perspective is repeatability, controlling repeatability of strike and repeatability of face to path is huge. Okay. And then the piggyback that is developing speed. So we have some examples like I showed you with the Bryson, okay, where essentially he's not as shifted. Okay, that's just an example. Okay. Here's an amateur player, okay, that was struggling with contact. Okay. And as you can see, like he moved 2 inches to the right by club shaft parallel P2. And unfortunately, even though his hip tilts were pretty good and whatnot, at some point, you kind of know who you're dealing with. And this wasn't a bad player. He's a pretty good player, but because he shifted too far to the right, he wasn't able to recover. And so if you start seeing those things occur and you're giving a lesson, you want to spearhead that right off the get-go. Obviously PGA Tour players, LPGA Tour players, they can do things that maybe, you and I can't do, but you start seeing these trends. So this is a good example, which is different because Alex with the driver actually gets to a similar situation, but he has the ability to push back to relative center. And Victor Hovland is another good example of that. So here's Victor, who right off the golf ball, you'll see his pelvis is 2.4 and his chest is 2.5 at that first release point at P2. So there isn't like one effective way to do this because obviously Victor's one of the best ball strikers in the world, and so is Bryson. But you can start seeing that the patterns are so different, and obviously there's a lot of different factors. This is one of them that we're highlighting. So we want to make sure that if you're a coach and you get a player like Victor or somebody who's in that pattern or somebody who's like Bryson or like Rory, that you kind of start understanding those two sides and how they interrelate to face to path, quality of impact, and then power at the end of the day, which kind of leads us into this conversation. Okay, so these are 3 examples. I'm not going to tell you who they are. I can't do that. But right here we have the COP at the top of the backswing. Should it, what would you say, like what is in range, right? And these are 3 different examples of different players with essentially controlled how much vertical force is under which foot at which time. And one of these is actually pretty centered and not producing a whole bunch of force, but he's still a tour player. So player 1, the COP is 71% on the trail side. Okay, and you can see the center of mass is obviously more trail side. And then player 2 at the top of the swing is only 26% at the top of the backswing on the lead side. And then player 3 is 11% at the trail side. So you could say that's why we put here. So you can see that the late trail side COP would be 1, a middle COP player, and then lead COP player. All these players right here are obviously different, and they're all hitting driver. But correspondingly, you can kind of imagine if 1, 2, and 3, their 3D is going to kind of line up with this principle. So you're not going to see the force ever in conflict with the alignments. And that's really why Phil and I are having this conversation with everybody, is because there's a little bit of, historically, there's an argument on the forces versus, the mechanics. And so we decided, well, we're just going to just overlay kinematics and kinetics and explain that there's a marrying effect going on, and there shouldn't be a conflict. But I think you can't just say, hey, we're only going to talk about kinetics without understanding that the kinematics has to be overlaid on top of that, or it's an incomplete picture, especially when you start looking at number one, which is the quality of strike. So that's like the big conversation that we're trying to have here. So I'm going to show you one more here in a sec. I think this will be very, very good. Let me pull this out. Okay. Whereas so here's Hostler a while back. Okay. All right, we'll go to P1. P2. Okay, so really getting that braking force. You can see there's a little bit of shift. Hits the brakes, okay, underneath that pelvis, and then starts pushing essentially forward from there to stabilize that. And you can start seeing by P3, it's already pushing back to recenter. And and by the way, guys, his swing's developed quite a bit since his time. But this goes right back to that conversation of, what are some trends that we're seeing with all the best players? We're kind of seeing some marrying degree of that. And we're seeing the torque value. We're seeing that in the rotation, especially on Sportsbox. That's always happening, especially amongst the best players. We're seeing a very similar correlation with the lift and how that's being affected throughout the golf swing. And if those things are kind of in there, you create more capability and more consistency. So I think that's probably, without getting this too far down the road, that's where I'd like everybody to kind of, put their thinking cap on, develop some questions. Definitely use a tech and do your own kind of little study on this. Start building your own patterns. I think that's a healthy challenge for everybody. And you'll kind of be surprised what comes out of it. You'll see that, these players tend to do this and this player tends to do this. That's why their ball flight does what it does. And I think in the end of the day, it kind of brings everybody onto the same page of understanding. So very good.
Awesome. Thank you, Dana.
You're welcome.
All right, I think we've got a few more questions. So if you guys have any questions on this information, feel free to drop them in the Q&A. Cody Smith says, any tips for a player that chest closer to target? And is any tips for a player that, I'm not really sure what the question is about. That chest closer to target. That's Cody, if you want to ask that question again. Not sure what kind of player you're referring to. And then James Kaiser, as an aging golfer, I'd love to see more talk about float loading and how to properly do it. So I've gotten a couple questions about float loading.
Okay. Are we talking about float loading?
Dana, if you want to take that on.
I mean, in theory, so float loading, that kind of takes me back to the Greg McHatton days, but it basically is the change of direction on the club shaft through the handle. Okay, so through the coupling point of the handle that the shaft starts to load. So in theory, it's wider to narrower. That should happen through the change of direction. So I don't know if it's really something you can per se make happen on 3D other than you can analyze it on 3D. So, but I would say that the best way to kind of ensure that you change direction appropriately is that pressure gets to the lead side early enough, and that the axis of rotation, if you look at the chest and the hips, is stacked on top of each other by P5. So if that's occurring, you have a pretty relative chance to change direction and load the shaft appropriately. If you have a conflict in that axis of rotation, you're going to have a conflict of the bottom. So that's where players start to, reorganize the shaft either early and lose wrist angles in order to make consistent contact. So I know that's a very blanket way of saying it. It's not specific, but there's too many examples of, players doing inappropriate things. It could be even hand path related if your hand path's off. But generally speaking, that's where I would kind of hang my hat. And then from there, explore from that point.
Yeah, and if I can make a little comment here as well, we do measure lead wrist angle, and so you can see float loading, downswing loading, casting, late release, all of that in the numbers. And in fact, in our certification level 2, we have a whole presentation on lead wrist angle, how to measure it, what the different profiles are. So yeah, Sportsbox does a good job of wrist angle, lead wrist angle.
I'd actually never heard of float loading as a terminology before.
You're too busy making money on tour, so don't worry.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's another word for downswing loading, basically.
Correct. Yeah.
That I've heard of. Okay. Any tips? Okay, so Cody says, I have a junior who shifts toward the target with the chest closer, like chest closer to target than pelvis from P2 to P4. Any tips?
Well, if I can I answer that? Okay. So first thing to look for is in the address position, what is their tilts, right? So if a player has proper address tilt, are they too zeroed out? That could become a problem. Maybe explore around the grip. If the face gets out of alignment because of that, the player could do that. But I think I have the picture in my head of what I'm looking for. So probably the pelvis is very, very tilted. So if it's a right-handed player, the lead hip is down, right hip is high. The player's probably not as forward with the lower body as needed. So the upper body is making up for it. And there's hyper rotation going on. So if there's hyper rotation going on, the hips probably are not forward enough. So therefore the upper body is just spinning out on top. So sometimes you see players that do this and the arms start to get behind them because there's too much horizontal going on. So the exploration would be is, number one, is the center of the pelvis in the correct location from P4 to P5? And if that's the case, and they're still doing that, then it might be a hand path situation. And that one's a little bit of subject to, I'd have to see it to make sure. But generally speaking, in this situation, there could be one way to do it is increase more horizontal force, right? More lead side going towards the target to reduce that. That's one way to do it. And then see on Sportsbox if that P5 position, things are stacked on top or is the upper axis too far forward. I think people get a little bit worried of sliding, but in this individual's situation, if things are good at P5 and they slide, it may not be a bad idea. because there should be a horizontal force going on in the golf swing just as much as a vertical and a rotational.
Okay. Ben Austin asked, can lift, drop, and transition affect sway and rotation?
Me or Phil?
Yeah, I think that an interesting question about lift and drop is that obviously it can also be a fault rather than a speed generator, depending on how it's being done. Obviously, if you're lifting and dropping, all of these motions are sequential and should be in the correct order. And also, if you combine them with other motions, such as thrust, then you end up with early extension and you've got problems in your path and so on and so forth. But generally, these are independent motions. So they can be done separately. You can turn and lift, you can turn and sway. So I think, again, if they are done correctly, they are independent. I don't know if you've got anything to add to that.
No, 100%. I think how you want to look at things is what pieces add up and what pieces complicate things. So, and I'm just paraphrasing to what Phil was saying, is that you could have a lot of lift to a fault because you're going to lose accuracy, right? At the end of the day, like if you're just thrusting just to thrust, you can't play golf at some point unless you have corresponding other pieces that are meshing with it. So I have some players that get above 3. And in order for them to do that, they have to create a lot of torque in other areas. So they have to have a lot of horizontal torque. Otherwise, they're just going to hit massive hooks and blocks. And so I think you want to look at the system as a whole. You know, does the system operate where you can find it? And this is, you know, this is actually, I think, Phil, I think we talked about this originally. This is the reason why we wanted to have this conversation. It was more or less like an icebreaker to the industry because, you know, you and I have similar backgrounds but different. So I'm originally a 2D guy, camera-based guy, and you're the 3D guy. And in the industry, you know, we have force plates, and you can't independently just use force plates. You have to look at the alignments of what's going on, and that's all good information. Like it's not bad. It's not bad information at all. But for whatever reason, the industry is not behaving like that. Now it is more or less now, but it was. It's like, oh, this guy's a vertical force player. Okay, yeah, I get that, but can he find a fairway? Like that's what it comes down to. So that's why I think this kind of like kumbaya's everybody together, have a conversation. Like, okay, we can create power, we can find the club face, we have a resulting path that's very consistent, and we don't have to operate under preferences here, but we can look at patterns and go, okay, that one's repeatable. So not to get on a podium here, guys, but that's kind of the big thing. I think it opens a little more clarity to that everything matters. I mean, we have just the other day on social media, you know, people are saying ground force doesn't really matter. It's like, oh, yeah, it does. Like everything does, but we have to look at it correctly.
Yeah, and another comment, technology is neither good nor evil, it's neutral.
Yeah.
The technology is how you use it and
Yeah.
how much you use it and whether you use it incorrectly or correctly. So to me, the more knowledge the instructor has, the more tools they have in their tool chest, the more they can draw from those tools and get the right answer for the golfer. So you don't want to spray the golfer with all of this numbers and all of the forces, and you can use it judiciously and appropriately. And I think that's the key to being a top instructor.
Okay.
Do we have
So
more?
yes, we have a few more, and we've got 3 or 4 minutes. So I don't, so Eric, I'm gonna butcher this last name, Ziegele, asked, given that the different body types needing different optimizing of the kinetic sequence parts, how does this factor a recommendation that matches swing sequence balance that aligns to the body structure? Not really sure what this question's getting at.
I think that one talks about Mike Adams stuff. Is that right?
Yeah, I think, yeah, yes.
Yeah, that's one I can't answer, to be honest.
Yeah. Might need to take that one offline. Okay. Let's keep going. Oh my goodness. Okay, what are your thoughts on internal forces? What's driving these forces?
Yeah, obviously what's driving those forces are the muscles. I mean, you've got your internal forces and you've got your external forces. And I had a little slide on that, but unfortunately I didn't put it into this. But bottom line, the way you create motion in the golf swing is your brain sends signals to your muscles, obviously in specific patterns, in specific firing orders. And then those muscles, they can only contract, they can't push. So they're in pairs, one on one side of the bone and one on the other side of the bone. They contract appropriately, that moves the bone. And now if you're in space, you can flail around and move because you're using only internal forces. But when we put you onto the ground on the earth, now you've got gravity pulling you down, holding you on the floor, and now you can create a golf swing because you've learned how to create those internal forces, which in turn create the ground reaction forces. They're called reaction forces because they're reacting to you and to your motion.
And then this one from Tatsuro, this is from 10 minutes ago, so I might be a little too late to the punch here, but is it correct that what Dana was displaying is that the purple graph indicates horizontal force?
I think so. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'd have to go back, but I think so. Yeah.
Okay, and then last question, how does the tendency change based on trajectory changes?
Yeah, so that's kind of an interesting thing, right? Because that's the skill of golf. So the skill of golf is not linear. So, you know, we have a preference of your golf swing should do this, but then if I want to hit it lower, I want to hit it higher. Phil's not going to like my vocabulary here, but the geometry changes. But
No, that's fine. I agree. I like the term geometry because you have to have specific geometry in order to put the club head on the ball.
Right. I had to throw that in there.
Thanks. No worries.
That was like a pre-dinner. Anyway, so yeah, so that's the thing is we start seeing correlations for your players. So if you have a player and you're trying to have the player hit it low, you know, you're going to put something out there, have them hit it under it, or have them hit it over it, and then see what they kind of internally cue to do that. So did they lean the shaft? Did they get their body more forward? Did they change the ball position? And then you can kind of direct them into saying, hey, like this is probably the best way to do it because it's going to be the most consistent or accurate. And then they know now, oh, well, this feels like a low shot. This is the mechanics I need to do that. And that's a good feedback loop to have.
Cool. Well, we're right at time. I can't thank you enough, Phil and Dana, for creating a great program today, and very excited that so many of us joined. I think I guessed right. I said 85. I think we're at 87 for most of the webinar. But yeah, have a great night, everyone. Thanks everyone for joining and for all the great questions.
That was a lot of fun. Thank you.
Bye, y'all.
Night.